Was the euthanization plan more morally unethical than the rumbling? The short answer, yes. Let me clarify. Pitting two forms of genocide against each other and trying to determine which is less bad isn't my intention. Both are undeniably horrific war crimes, but when analyzing crimes against humanity, we often look at the why, the reasoning or intent behind them. It's horrible, yes, but understanding the motivations can reveal the deeper context. So what's the why behind the rumbling? The rumbling was Aaron's last-ditch attempt to protect the people of Paradise. To truly understand it, we need to unpack the dystopian society in which Attack on Titan takes place in. Paradise was an island that was completely isolated from the rest of the world. Diplomacy, something essential for any nation to coexist, didn't exist for them until they discovered the existence of other nations. And even then, diplomacy was either ignored or outright failed. Let's talk about diplomacy. Diplomacy is the cooperation between nations. It's about managing relationships, resolving conflicts, and fostering peace through negotiation and compromise. Think of the United Nations, a global forum for diplomacy that helps countries resolve disputes and tackle issues like human rights and climate change. It's a cornerstone of human coexistence. And in Attack on Titan, inspired by real-world events like World War I, diplomacy could have been an easily solution to the problems presented in the show. But when the outside world was revealed, the people of Paradise quickly learned they were deeply hated and feared. Eldians were viewed as monsters, devils capable of unleashing the power of Titans. That prejudice made meaningful diplomacy nearly impossible. Let's talk about the failed attempts at diplomacy in AOT. Take the nation of Hizuru, for example. They were Paradise's first potential ally. The Azumabito clan proposed modernizing Paradise into a military power to defend itself. They suggested using the founding Titan to periodically unleash a mini rumbling as a show of strength. At the same time, they'd help Paradise develop new technology and military capabilities, which sounds promising, right? Except there were glaring flaws in this plan. Number one, the technology gap. Paradise was decades behind the rest of the world. Even with Hizuru's help, they wouldn't catch up in time to defend themselves against nations like Marley, which was already developing anti-Titan weaponry. Number two, the global hatred. The fear and prejudice toward Eldians were so deeply rooted that no modernization or military strength would change it. And lastly, time. Time was a luxury that the people of Paradise didn't have. The world was united in its desire to destroy the Eldians, and the clock was ticking. The Azumabito plan was naive and short-sighted. Diplomacy was doomed before it even began. And Aaron realized this. The world would never stop trying to destroy his home. That's the why behind the rumbling. Aaron's actions, while horrifying, were deeply rooted in reasoning and survival. He saw no other choice, and while we could spend hours debating his motivations, there's one key difference between him and Zeke: depth. Depth matters because it gives actions meaning beyond their surface. Without it, motivations feel hollow or purely practical. Depth is what makes Aaron's rumbling not just an act of genocide, but a tragic culmination of desperation, fear, and survival. It's why, despite the horrors of his actions, we're compelled to analyze and debate his choices. Aaron's depth doesn't absolve him, of course. It complicates him, forces us to grapple with his humanity, and elevates him from a villain into a character with layered dimensions. It makes his story unforgettable, not for what he did, but for why he did it. The euthanization plan lacks that crucial depth, making it much more unethical and cruel than the rest, or any plan presented for that matter. While the rumbling was an immediate catastrophe, Zeke's plan represented a slow-motion, agonizing extinction. The psychological torment, loss of hope, and poorly thought-out plan make it arguably even more cruel. A slow-motion disaster. Zeke's plan to sterilize all Eldians and slowly wipe out their bloodline wasn't just horrific. It was cruel on a scale that's hard to imagine. And here's why. As the Eldian population aged with no younger generation to take over, society would begin to crumble. Essential roles like farming, infrastructure, maintenance, and medical care would disappear. Think about it. Who would grow food, repair homes, or care for the sick and elderly? Without these key systems, Eldian would face, number one, food shortages. Farmers would grind to a halt. The land, already under strain, would become barren and overgrown. Starvation would set in, leading to widespread suffering. Medical crisis. With no doctors or nurses to provide care, the aging population would suffer through untreated illnesses and injuries. And infrastructure collapse. Roads, homes, and other essential structures would fall into disrepair, making the environment increasingly uninhabitable. the natural environment itself would turn against them. Over time, an unmaintained ecosystem would rise to plagues and infections and infestations. Imagine a decaying society filled with disease, rot, and despair. Eldians wouldn't live peacefully as they faded away. They'd endure a horrific, slow extinction surrounded by the decay of everything they'd built. Worse yet, this collapse would make them vulnerable to external threats. Even as Eldians suffered, their enemies like Marley would likely exploit or invade them. Imagine the final remnant of the Eldian people being massacred in their weakest states, helpless and unable to fight back. What's even more disturbing about Zeke's plan is how poorly thought out it was. He framed it as an act of mercy, but it was deeply selfish and personal. Zeke's motivation wasn't about protecting the Eldians, it was about his own guilt and his desire to die as a martyr.
Why the hell did you come back?
To show my loyalty to Marley, and to atone for the sins of Eldia. Please allow me to take part in open training, sir.
He wanted to erase his people to atone for the sins they didn't even commit, a belief rooted in Marleyan propaganda. He didn't even think about the societal and environmental factors and consequences this would have. The man was on a suicide mission. And let's not forget how disappointing the Survey Corp's reaction was. When Zeke proposed using Historia to further his plan, their willingness to entertain it felt like a betrayal. Historia, who had spent her life being manipulated and exploited, deserved better. And yet no one in the Survey Corp stood up for her. No one except for Eren. Eren was the only one who recognized that the Eldians shouldn't be the one to suffer like this, to be continued to be treated like the livestock they fought to obtain liberation and freedom from their entire lives. Although Historia did agree to this, I acknowledge that. She obviously didn't want to actually do it deep down. I mean, this was her facial expression after Eren was the only one who stood up for her. I mean, these are the same Eldians that condemned Marley for dehumanizing Eldians, was doing the exact same to Historia. It was a complete failure of leadership and conviction. Both the rumbling and the Euthanasia plan were horrific, but the key difference lies in the reasoning behind them. Eren's actions, while devastating, were born out of a desperate attempt to save his people. Zeke's plan, on the other hand, was selfish, unthought out, and cruel on a level that's hard to comprehend. The rumbling was an immediate, catastrophic plan, but Zeke's plan represented a prolonged nightmare, one that would see the Eldians suffer for generations as their society collapsed around them. In the end, the rumbling and the Euthanasia plan both ask us to question the lengths we're willing to go to protect or to destroy a people. And while there's no right answer, one thing is clear. Zeke's plan wasn't mercy, it was a death sentence, drawn out in the most horrific way possible.